Welcome to Petros Family Wealth. Today we're going to talk about how to inherit a home from a parent or loved one. Let's go ahead and dive in. If you're curious about your own estate plan, or you're helping design your parents' estate plan, please go ahead and try this other video where we talk about the pre-planning phases. This video is going to be focused on the event where your parents have passed away and you're receiving a home and what to do next. So the first thing we want to do is identify how the home is titled or owned. One of the first options is that it would be in a trust, what's called a transfer on death, or if it was held in their name or jointly owned or individually owned, which would be a probate or through a will process. You can identify which ownership structure it is by just calling the county, and sometimes you can even just look up the address on the county property tax website to identify if there's a transfer on death, if it's owned by a trust, or if it was owned by one of your parents individually or jointly. But let's say, for example, it's in the form of a trust. Then what we need to do is identify who is the trustee or who's in charge of that trust. So it's typically in a trust document. And just look for trustees, search for trustees. And if it's, for example, if it's for yourself, you are in charge of that trust and that home is in that trust. So you're in charge of the home. What you would need to do is create a new tax identification number. Because of your parents passing, it was usually in their own social security number. And so you can create one through, again, the IRS website. But don't get hooked on some of those created tax ID numbers. There's a couple of spam online websites out there that say that they'll create a tax ID for you for $50. It's free on the IRS website. So please don't get sucked into one of those. Once you create the new tax ID number and you're a trustee, you're in charge and you have to follow the rules of the trust. So the trust might say that that the wealth inside this trust is going to transition to you and your siblings. It could say that this home would go to a specific sibling and then commensurately wealth pass to the other siblings. If it just says, for example, that it goes to each of your siblings, then I'd recommend where you would connect with your siblings to see if anybody were to purchase or own that property compared to maybe other assets that might be in the trust. But ultimately, it's your decision as a trustee. But it does make sense to take your brothers and sisters' considerations in mind. The second is what's called a transfer on death. That one is one of the simpler options out there. And if your parents set up what's called a TOD, transfer on death, sometimes it's called a payable on death for many different types of bank accounts. But the process for that one is basically you provide the death certificate as well as what's called a quit claim deed. Generally what we found is that the county websites or the county servicers are more than happy to help walk you through and fill out those forms. And after those forms are filed, there's usually a $20, $45 fee to file those. Now you're in charge of the home. The last one is if the home was in the name of your parents or parent and they passed away, then you have to go transition that home through a will or a probate process. This one takes a little bit more time. And that probate process uses the will that your parents might have had. And if there's no will, then there's a step-by-step guide as far as where that wealth would transition towards. If there is a will, then we want to look for who the personal representative is. That's the person that's going to be charged with carrying out the will's guidance and wishes. The first step is to, again, call the county court that the property was in and identify what the steps are for probate. Or you can contact an attorney to help you through this process. This one does take probably at a minimum between 2 and anywhere between 18 months. So just be prepared and making sure to help maintain the home while the estate is being settled. Other questions that you might want to ask or think about once you identify what the actual process is. The first one is what's called a cost basis step up. So if your parents had a revocable trust or they held it in a transfer on death or will, then there's what's called a step up in cost basis. So your parents might have purchased the home for $100,000 and over time it's now worth $300,000. Highly recommend that you have what's called an appraisal on the value of the property. What that does, and especially if it's a qualified appraisal versus a real estate estimate or realtor's estimate of the market value, let's say that appraisal is $300,000, you can use that as your stepped up cost. So in the event that you sell it, doesn't have to be right away, but at some point if you do sell it, your cost is $300,000. So if you sold it for $300,000, no taxable event. If you don't have that appraisal and don't have something to back up the step up in cost basis, the IRS may come back to you and try to tax you on that $200,000 difference between the purchase price of your parents and the $300,000 of that market value. So that appraisal really is to help back you as far as potentially saving you on capital gains tax. The other consideration is assuming the mortgage. This is going to be even more important as time goes on because interest rates were so low for so long and now they're much higher. If there was a mortgage on the property, you can assume that loan at that lower interest rate. You have to reach out to the bank, the mortgagor, and figure out the process of assuming that loan. Generally, you do have to re-qualify for that loan in order to make sure that the bank understands and confirms that you can take on that debt servicing. So that would be assuming the mortgage if you wanted to keep the property. Last question, this is the hardest one. Do you want to sell it? And this is particularly hard if this is going to be a cabin or a long-term family property. A lot of emotional and sentimental value associated with it. The way to think about it is what Dave Ramsey has shared. Dave Ramsey, if the home is worth $300,000, what he says is if you have $300,000 lying on a table, what would you do with those funds? Would you buy this home? That's the way to look at it. And if it is to buy the home, then you should keep the home. If it's not, then it likely makes sense both for personal financials as well as any siblings that you might have to go ahead and sell that and distribute the assets for the full market value. So those are a couple different ways to settle an estate as far as specifically to their home. If you'd like more information about basic terminology of estate planning, please go ahead and click here, and looking forward to sharing some more information. Please go ahead and like, subscribe, and hit that notification button for more videos in the future. Thank you.